Now, monks, I declare to you, all conditioned things are of a nature to decay. Strive on untiringly. These were the last words of the Buddha before he went into meditation and passed away. In this lecture, we will follow what happened to the Buddha's teachings after his death up to the time when one of its major schools, Theravada, was introduced to Sri Lanka. For 45 years, the Buddha taught people what he had realized under the Bodhi tree that one day. However, he never wrote down any of his teachings. Moreover, as a good teacher that he was, he adjusted his explanation to the ability of the person he was talking to. For example, when he converted Yasa, a wealthy young man from Benares, he started with explaining the importance of giving alms and observing precepts. Then he moved on to talk about the evil of various desires and, conversely, the benefits of stopping these desires. Only after that, the Buddha told him about the Four Noble Truths. Thus, with Yasa, he started with practical advice that was easier to grasp. Whereas with the Kassapa brothers, who had magical power and had 1,000 followers altogether, he showed miracles to convince them. Having such a flexible, competent teacher is great if you can learn from him directly in person, but not so much when he's not with you anymore. Then you need systematized teachings. The Buddha's disciples must have felt the same way, and they got together shortly after the Buddha's passing and went over everything he had taught them. This is called the First Council. Concerning the Buddha's teachings, Mahakassapa, who had called for the council, asked Ananda to list everything he knew, because Ananda had accompanied the Buddha for the last 25 years. Each phrase Ananda recited, everyone else repeated it in unison as a sign of approval. As for the rules of the monastic order, Mahakassapa asked Upali, who then stated when and under what circumstances the Buddha taught each of them. Thus, the core of Buddhist scripture was founded. Now, before we move on, let me explain what I mean by Buddhist scripture. So, at the first council, Ananda recited the Buddha's teachings and Upali recited his rules, but these disciples at the council never wrote them down. Instead, they transmitted them as oral traditions. The Buddha's teachings and rules were thus passed down by way of recitation for centuries. Eventually, however, people started to write them down, and it seems that they felt it important to do so when Buddhism spread to other countries. Buddhism was introduced to Sri Lanka in the 3rd century BCE in Pali, the language similar to Magadha, which the Buddha is thought to have used. Even there in Sri Lanka, however, the Pali canon were transmitted orally first, until they were finally written down in the 1st century and became the 5 Nikayas, or collections. They are the Digha, or long Nikaya, Majjhima, or middle-length Nikaya, Samyutta, or grouped Nikaya, Anguttara, or numbered Nikaya, and Khuddaka, or minor Nikaya. The last one, the minor Nikaya, contains famous writings and stories such as Dhammapada, Stanipata, and Jatakas, and is thought to have been created later than the other 4. Now, as we will see, Buddhism was introduced to China as well, but in this case, the original teachings were translated first into Sanskrit and then into Chinese. And it just so happened that there are 4 Chinese agamas or traditions that correspond to the first 4 Nikayas. So, There you have it, the oldest text of the Buddha's teachings. We just have to keep reminding ourselves that, even though these scriptures are the earliest ones, they were compiled after the Buddha passed away and did not get written down for 300 years. But wait, what about the rules recited by Upali? They were also written down in both Pali and Chinese. Being the rules for community, they were transmitted separately within each school when different schools started to appear. Now, let's take a moment and see what kind of rules there were and what kind of life early Buddhist monks and nuns lived. The Buddha thought that pursuing the Buddhist path toward enlightenment is impossible without renouncing the world and entering the Sangha. To enter the Sangha, one must first take the 10 precepts, which are not to kill, not to steal, not to have sexual intercourse, not to lie, not to have intoxicating drinks, not to eat after noon, not to attend parties, not to wear garlands, perfumes, or cosmetics, not to use high or broad beds, and not to accept money. This is the novice ordination. When you reach the age of 20, or after a certain period of time, you can take full ordination and become a bhikkhu, monk, or a bhikkhuni, nun. There are 227 rules for men and 311 for women, although these numbers differ from school to school. These rules are to be chanted twice a month, and those who have broken any of them must confess at these occasions. Monks and nuns are to have almost no belongings: 3 clothes, a bowl, a rug, and a water filtering bag to avoid killing insects by accidentally drinking them. They get up early and meditate. After collecting alms of food, they eat it in their only meal of the day before noon. They spend the afternoon meditating or visiting lay followers. In the evening, there is a time for discussing Buddhist teachings and practices with others or talking to your mentor. Upon retreating to their room, they do more meditation before they go to bed. Thus, monks and nuns live very simple and devoted life according to the rules set up by the Buddha, which are to help the monastics cultivate morality and to maintain order in the Sangha. So, we have a basket of scripture about teachings and a basket of scripture about rules. The basket of teachings is called the Sutra Pitaka, and the basket of rules is called the Vinaya Pitaka. But there is one more basket, the Abhidharma Pitaka. The Abhidharma Pitaka is a collection of study guides, so to speak. As mentioned before, the Buddha changed the way he explained the truth based on the ability and disposition of the person he was talking to. Moreover, he used allegorical stories a lot, which could call for various interpretations. Thus, people started to write guidebooks to clarify the Buddha's teachings. But these books went further than that, delving deep into analyzing the detailed workings of cause and effect. Both the Pali Canon and the Chinese Canon include 7 texts in the Abhidharma Pitaka, but the Chinese texts are limited to one school rather than many. So, by nature, the Abhidharma texts were created later than the texts of the other 2 baskets. Still, these 3 baskets, or Tripitaka, constituted the authoritative scripture for much of early Buddhism. Now, let's go back to the history of Buddhism. About 100 years after the Buddha's death, during the 3rd century BCE, the Sangha experienced a schism. It is thought to be triggered by a disagreement about the Vinaya rules. The Buddha set up these rules to help monks and nuns concentrate on their pursuit of enlightenment and to ensure smooth governance of the community within the social framework of his time. But various things in a society change over the course of 100 years. Take money, for example. The Buddha prohibited monks and nuns from accepting money. But as monetary economy developed, more and more people would use money on daily basis, and soon it would be difficult to stop lay followers from offering money to them instead of actual food. Then what would you do? Keep asking them for food even though you know that that would inconvenience them? We don't know exactly what kind of issues caused friction, but there emerged those who thought that rules should be adjusted to the social reality of the time. And of course, there were also conservative Buddhists who maintained that the Buddha's rules must be kept intact. To solve this problem, a second council was held at Vaishali. In the end, the conservatives prevailed and the Vinaya rules were to be observed strictly. However, the liberals would not take it. They formally separated themselves and came to be known as Mahasangika, or Great Community. The other side was Staviravada, or Theravada in Pali, meaning the way of the elders. Once the unity was broken, nothing could stop further fragmentation. Naturally, it happened within the Mahasangika school first, but the Staviravada school also saw its members splitting away. Most often, the bone of contention was about the teachings and not the rules, unlike the first split. People developed different views about the Dharma. In the end, it is said that there were about 20 major schools of thought, and they were called Abhidharma schools because they were all trying to philosophically explicate the ideas presented in the Abhidharma Pitaka. Now, Abhi means toward, and so Abhidharma means toward the Dharma. Then, what does Dharma mean? It means many things. It could be social law or natural order. It could be truth or teaching. And it could also mean the basic elements of a thing. In trying to explain how this world works and figure out the best way of practice, Abhidharma scholars focused on the most fundamental elements of life and analyzed how they existed and how they related to each other. It seems that the theoretical conundrum that led to the emergence of various schools has its roots in the Buddha's teaching that nothing in this world is permanent and that there is no self, combined with the contemplative and analytical nature of Buddhism. For example, according to the Sarvastivadin school, which was a major school that came of Staviravada, there are 75 dharmas. If you look at a forest, you know that there is no such thing as a forest in reality. All you have are a bunch of trees. And if you look at a tree, it is an aggregate of leaves, branches, roots, and a trunk. And if you look at a leaf, you have water and fiber, and if you have a microscope, you can see cells, and so on and so on. The Buddha pointed out this non-real existence of things in the concept of self. We think that our self exists and that self controls what we think and do. But in reality, our consciousness is based on many elements. And these elements can be categorized into 5 groups according to the Buddha. Likewise, Sarvastivadin scholars dissected everything in this world into its smallest elements. It's like how scientists anatomize things into atoms. The difference is, however, Buddhists also dissected mental processes. For example, desire is one of mental elements that cannot be divided further, and it exists on its own. However, because it could disappear, it is a conditioned dharma. All conditioned dharmas, like desire, can be divided into four groups, only one of which is about the material world. The world is thus made up of constant fusions and fragmentations of these elements. But then, the next question is, what causes such fusions and fragmentations? Sarvastivadin scholars recognized six types of causes, but that's not all. For causes to bring effects, there must be certain conditions. And they saw four types of conditions. When these causes and conditions are combined, they could have five types of effects. So this is all good, but if each element is ephemeral and exists only momentarily, then how can it be connected to its effect sequentially? To answer this question logically, Sarvastivadin scholars came to a radical conclusion. According to them, all these elements exist not only at the same time, but also in the past, present, and future. Or rather, all periods of time exist simultaneously, and elements go from one realm to the other and other. This explanation, I guess, is logical, but it obviously contradicts the Buddha's teaching that nothing exists permanently, hence the conundrum. In this way, Abhidharma scholars debated with each other for more than 200 years. In the meantime, there occurred another serious schism, once again concerning the Vinaya. It was around 250 BCE, and this time, King Ashoka called for a third council in Pataliputra. It was around this time that the way of the elders was becoming established in Sri Lanka under the Pali name of Theravada.